anyone look upon the well-preserved face of a man who died 3,000 years ago without fascination, fear, or disgust? We find something chilling and alien in the Egyptian obsession with preserving their dead. The mummy has inspired countless horror movies and tales of the supernatural. Yet if we turn from fantasy to science, we find the mummy also gives us a wealth of facts about the ancient Egyptians, their way of life, their ailments and injuries.
I'm John Rhys-Davies. Join me as we explore the secrets of the mummies, next on Archaeology.
Death, eternal punishment for anyone who opens this casket in the name of Amun-Ra, the king of the gods. Good heavens, what a terrible curse!
It was one of Boris Karloff's earliest starring roles, the box office hit of 1932, The Mummy. The movie helped to fix the popular idea that the preserved bodies of ancient Egyptians possessed supernatural powers, even the power to kill. The mummy's curse is one of the most persistent legends of Egyptology. Bad luck, sudden illnesses or accidents are all said to dog anyone foolish enough to meddle with mummies.
To date, no one has actually found any curse inscribed on a sarcophagus or carved in an Egyptian tomb. The story of the curse was the invention of an enterprising journalist trying to cash in on the mania for mummies. So if the ancient Egyptians didn't, as far as we can tell, associate their mummies with some type of curse, what exactly did they have in mind when they created these things that so frighten and fascinate us? Can today's scientists shed light on these forgotten dead?
In ancient Egypt, the kingdom of the dead was ruled by Osiris, who was murdered by his brother Seth, then torn into 14 pieces and scattered around the earth. Osiris' sister and wife, Isis, found all but one of the pieces, bandaged them together, and created the first mummy. From this legend grew a sophisticated practice of preservation that would evolve over 3,500 years. To the ancient Egyptians, the body was as important after death as it was in life. They believed that part of the soul left the body to visit the underworld at night, only to return to it at sunrise. But the soul had to recognize the body in order to return to it, so the body had to be well preserved. Should the body be destroyed, the soul would be lost forever. At first, the Egyptians relied on a natural process to preserve the dead. They simply buried bodies in the desert sand where they dried out. Egypt's desert climate even preserved the final agony of this man, who for some unknown reason was bound and sealed alive in a coffin, perhaps as ghastly punishment for an unknown crime. As time went on, the Egyptians developed more elaborate mummification techniques, and the mummy became more lifelike. They removed the organs and packed natron, a natural salt from the Nile Valley, around the bodies to draw out the moisture. The whole process took more than 2 months. Nasri Iskander is the Director of Conservation at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo.
The process of mummification is to extract the liquids and the moistures inside the tissues of the body, and also dissolving the fat materials between tissues in the body. And this keep microbes and bacteria and viruses limited.
Once the embalmers removed the organs and dried out the tissues, they wrapped the body in bandages. They painstakingly wrapped each finger and toe individually. The heart, which recorded good and bad deeds committed in life, remained in the body so that it might be judged in the afterlife. The embalmers stuffed the cheeks and the body with resin-soaked linen or sawdust to maintain a lifelike appearance. Any materials used in preparing the mummy were buried near the tomb to prevent them being used to put a spell on the deceased. But mummification was only part of the ritual. Tombs had to be stocked with food and clothing to sustain the ka, a part of the soul which resided with the mummy. The Egyptians believed that models of servants, laborers, and ships placed inside the tomb sprang magically to life. The massive scale of the Old Kingdom pyramids, dating from 2600 BC, was inspired partly to deter tomb robbers. Ironically, they served only as beacons, attracting looters to the riches entombed within. Clearly another plan was called for. Beginning around 1500 BC, the pharaohs of the New Kingdom chose a different way to hide their royal mummies, concealing them in tombs hollowed out of the rock in a desolate, narrow, easily guarded valley near present-day Luxor, the Valley of the Kings. In 1922, when most scholars had already declared the valley exhausted of treasures, English archaeologist Howard Carter made one of the most sensational discoveries of all: the intact burial place of the boy king Tutankhamun. Among the treasures was the royal mummy, encased in 3 magnificent coffins and a face mask of beaten sheet gold. The discovery brought instant fame to Carter and awoke popular interest in the exotic beliefs of Egyptian religion. As a boy, archaeologist Don Ryan was inspired by the stories of Howard Carter and Tutankhamun. His interest led him to the Valley of the Kings, where he now investigates the tombs of the unknown and overlooked.
There are about 60 tombs in the Valley of the Kings. About half of them are these spectacularly decorated royal tombs. What I've looked at are about the 30 other little tombs that have no decoration and have not attracted the attention of most Egyptologists and archaeologists. We've found lots of mummies of children and teenagers and males and females that give a broader perspective to the history of the Valley of the Kings rather than just big royal burials.
Most of the public's mummy mania centers on astonishing finds such as Tutankhamun. But mummification wasn't reserved strictly for royalty. Of the millions of mummies that once existed, only a small percentage were of noble birth.
One thing that really does excite me is we are looking at tombs that have been ignored in the past, and as we examine these tombs, we're finding all sorts of exciting things that nobody ever expected. And it's tombs that have mummies in them, hitherto unknown, and objects and things that are really adding a new dimension to the history of the Valley of the Kings.
Before it attracted the attention of archaeologists and historians, the valley attracted its share of unsavory characters. Robbers and treasure hunters have sought the gold of the pharaohs for centuries. 100 years ago, enterprising businessmen found a use for the mummies themselves, grinding them into medicinal powders, stripping their wrappings to make paper, and even using them to stoke the fireboxes of locomotives. During a tour of Egypt, American author Mark Twain wrote that he heard a railroad engineer remark, "Damn these plebeians, they don't burn worth a cent. Pass out a king." Perhaps the most famous explorer and exploiter of the Valley of the Kings was a former circus strongman named Giovanni Belzoni. A discoverer and plunderer of tombs, Belzoni described one experience in a pitch-dark burial chamber. "I sought a resting place, but when my weight bore on the body of a dead Egyptian, It crushed it like a bandbox. Every step I took, I crushed a mummy in some place or another. In 1817, Belzoni recorded how he dug into tomb 21 and found two well-preserved mummies with long hair lying on the floor. Now, Don Ryan is investigating this forgotten tomb.
They're a little higher than this. It took us about a month to dig through the debris to reach the entrance. And I was very excited about the possibility of finding these two female mummies described by Belzoni intact. But disappointment came quickly. And the further I went into the tomb, I found more and more legs, hands, feet, and all the parts of two female mummies extremely badly damaged. One that was missing a head.
When Ryan placed all the body parts together, both of the female mummies had their left arm flexed and their left hand clenched. This was believed to be a symbol of royalty. But there were no inscriptions in the tomb to indicate who the two privileged women were. Ryan's quest for forgotten tombs led him to a vault known as Tomb 60.
Well, Howard Carter found this tomb in 1903 on his great quest to discover a large decorated royal tomb. And he ran across this little tomb. It was very small, crudely carved, and undecorated. Had no interest to him. He noted there were a couple mummies inside and proceeded to cover it back up and went on and found a few days later a big royal tomb, just as he was hoping.
With the help of Carter's field notes, Ryan began searching for the forgotten tomb. He swept the limestone bedrock with a broom and in just half an hour found the edge of a pit. It concealed a stairway leading down into the rock.
And what we found was a tomb that had not been damaged by water, and we knew there was probably a mummy inside, and sure enough in the burial chamber we found what appears to be a royal female mummy lying on the floor.
About 25 years ago, the American Egyptologist Elizabeth Thomas said that if Tomb 60 were ever to be rediscovered, that perhaps the mummy of Hatshepsut would be found inside. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt for 21 years. She became as legendary as Cleopatra or Nefertiti. 3,500 years ago, she commissioned this magnificent temple built just outside the Valley of the Kings. Her tomb has been found very close to Tomb 60, but there was no mummy inside. Had priests hidden it from robbers in an inconspicuous tomb close by?
And sure enough, when we entered the tomb, we found a very wonderfully embalmed mummy of a female striking this apparent royal pose. But I think it's important to stress that even though it's fun to speculate in history and Egyptology, with the data we have now, we have no way whatsoever of positively ascertaining the identity of this mummy. So if people want to speculate about Hatshepsut, that's fine.
Today, Ryan continues to uncover artifacts which bring to life the burial rituals of the ancient Egyptians.
These big whitened jars are typical of the 18th dynasty for caching embalming materials. So it's possible these came from a large pot that's been whitened and obviously broken.
But rituals are only one piece of the puzzle. What can modern science tell us about the life of someone who has been dead more than 3,000 years? The science of mummies took off in the 1960s, when X-rays, the microscope, CAT scans, and chemical analysis all came to the archaeologist's aid. Mummy wrappings were tested and found to contain preservatives such as beeswax, resin, and glue.
All right, here we go. Perfect. Wonderful.
Recently at Knoxville's McClung Museum, this excellently preserved mummy was chosen for testing by Doctors Jim Harris and Brian Ingalls, both orthodontists. Dr. Harris's interest in physical anthropology led him to the well-preserved skeletons of Egypt. He is now among the world's foremost authorities on mummies and pioneered the use of X-rays for studying mummies.
Brian, do you think we should take the film holder out and put it on later?
Yeah, I think so. That's why I raised it up. I think we've got...
Because it goes in easily.
Inscriptions on the mummy case say that this was Jed Cons Iwef Ankh, or Jed to his friends, a priest and scribe of Luxor a little less than 3,000 years ago. Earlier tests suggested he had died in his 20s of unknown causes.
X-rays are one of the tools, one of the many tools that can be used to look at disease and ascertain what the individual did indeed die from.
Radiology is important to Harris for another reason. X-rays do not destroy the mummy.
We have never been involved in dissection, for example, of mummies. We've always left them intact, and X-rays permit us to do that.
Harris and Ingalls share another goal besides identifying disease. They also want to compare mummies in order to determine family resemblances. To do this requires positioning the X-ray source at exactly the same distance and angle away from the head. They use a laser beam to line up Jed's ear and adjust the entire head to the right position.
There you go. Now it's just hitting the... What's really wonderful is the mummy's head is almost vertical, because sometimes they're tipped, you know. Sometimes we have to tip the machine extensively, and this is really nicely positioned.
They've measured profiles of skulls from hundreds of mummies, allowing them to identify populations from different time periods and regions of Egypt. Because most of the royal mummies were rewrapped and reburied in approximately 1000 BC, their identities are questionable. Harris and Ingalls are seeking to establish a more accurate family tree of pharaohs by trying to confirm if one royal mummy appears related to another.
We have been somewhat suspicious that some of the pharaohs have not been correctly identified. And what many people don't realize is that all the pharaohs, except Tutankhamun, were found in 2 collections in Egypt, and none of them were original burials. They were all rewrapped by the priests of the 21st dynasty.
One of those 2 burial collections was here. 40 royal mummies, including Ramses II, Tutmosis I, the second, the third, and Amenhotep I, were found jammed together at the bottom of this shaft near the Valley of the Kings in 1881. Priests had hidden them there around 1000 BC after their original tombs had been looted.
The assumption has been that each pharaoh has been correctly identified. We have wondered whether or not some of the pharaohs could biologically be the son or father of the succeeding pharaoh. So we have challenged some of the identifications of the pharaohs in particularly the 18th dynasty.
In the case of Jed, there's little confusion. He was apparently in his original coffin, complete with its inscription.
It's almost like he's dislocated the scapula.
It is.
And,
Well, the wear in his teeth, you know, which are inconsistent, but they make you think that he's older than 20.
In the mid-20s.
It's an unusual amount of wear for a 20-year-old.
The facial structure of Jed is compared with Ramses II, the longest reigning pharaoh in the New Kingdom, who had most of the monuments in the Valley of the Kings and neighboring Luxor built in commemoration of himself.
This is Ramses II here, and this is Jed. One can see an age difference as it relates to the jaws themselves. There's advanced periodontal disease and abscesses that were involved in Ramses II, but he was quite old at death. In Jed, there is not that same degree of involvement in the infrastructure of the teeth and roots, but rather there's a severe wear.
But the most startling fact about Jed was the treatment of the brain.
But then we'll see what's in here.
We'll see what's going on there.
In most mummies, including Ramses, the brain had been removed via the nasal cavity, but Jed's appears to be partially intact, preserved with some substance that X-rays can't penetrate.
All this massive resin shrinks.
But you're saying that the brain is not shrunk?
That's what's amazing to me. Why?
Just that much.
That's phenomenal.
The brain is very, very different in Jed than it is in the other mummies that we've studied in Egypt, both royal and non-royal, because basically the brain was removed through the ethmoid plate, through the nose, it was dissolved, and then in its place, it's believed that material like resin, molten resin, was poured into the brain case, because the brain, number one, was thought to have no use in ancient Egypt. They did not know what the brain was for. And in Jed, we have possibly the brain that's been preserved.
Harris and Ingalls have now concluded that perhaps as much as a quarter of Jed's brain is preserved at the back of the skull, probably left there by accident. The rest of the cavity is filled up with resin. They've also compared their X-ray profile of Jed to the profiles that they have compiled of hundreds of mummies. Jed's nose and chin are typical of Nile Valley men of 3,000 years ago, thus confirming the age assigned to the body by other means. The new work has also determined that this young priest had worn teeth, but was in robust, good health just prior to his death, presumably by some sudden infection.
With all our work, this is a beginning. Always, this is just a field laboratory approach, and it's just like when we're in Egypt, we take all the material back to our laboratories and thoroughly analyze it. So this is strictly a preliminary look at this mummy and at the X-rays. And there'll be many people coming along that are much more sophisticated than we are in our approaches, as we have been from the people before us. And so we each build on the science of the time. We've got a couple X-ray plates.
The information gathered by Harris and Ingalls, coupled with other scientific methods like carbon dating and DNA analysis, add to the innovative study of ancient peoples. And none too soon. Egyptian mummies represent a precious legacy that has been nearly lost through modern indifference. Few of the millions of Egyptian mummies have survived the abuse of man and the ravages of nature, and too many lie ignored and unstudied in the storerooms of museums around the world. The ancient Egyptians believed they could assure immortality through mummification. In a way, they were right. As archaeologists and scientists continue their work, these forgotten dead reach out across the millennia to tell us about their lives, their families, and their beliefs, about their civilization and the people who built it. If we cannot put ourselves in the ancient Egyptians' minds, share their beliefs about the voyage of the soul, we can all be touched by the humanity of their remains.
By the time of the Roman Empire, Egyptian burial practices had changed. The coffins were elaborately painted, but inside, the mummified remains quickly turned to dusty skeletons. Soon the art of the mummy maker was lost, the spiritual reasons for mummification forgotten, and the superstitious fascination began. Only in our own times has science stripped away the mummy's macabre trappings and restored to us the humanity of the Egyptian dead.
Two ancient great civilizations, one rigid and authoritarian, changeless and unrelenting, the other spirited, free-thinking, timeless and original. Could one have inspired the other?
I'm John Rhys-Davies. Join me as we ask, did Egypt shape the glory that was Greece? Next on Archaeology.
Rising from the parched sands of the desert, in the land of the pharaohs, are the earliest stone monuments ever constructed in ancient Egypt. Though shrouded in antiquity, they bear an eerie resemblance to another famous landmark built 2,000 years later.
If an advertiser wants to sell his goods and give them a high-class feeling and make them seem classic, or if a bank wants to seem reliable, or if a university wants to seem respectable, the ideal thing to show is a fluted column, preferably in rows. And the idea of the fluted column is really seen as at the basis of European civilization. And when we think of the basis of European civilization, we think of Greece, we think of Athens, and we think of the Parthenon with its rows of exquisite columns. Now, the Parthenon was built about 2,500 years ago, and these columns, which we're walking through now, were in fact built about 2,500 years earlier still. So they're twice as old as the Parthenon.
For one maverick historian, the resemblance is no coincidence. He thinks the ancient Greeks owe a debt to Africa for their cultural heritage. If he is right, the history of Western civilization will need to be rewritten. But is he?
Generations of school children have been taught of the glory that was Greece, of a white civilization that gave birth to cherished notions of democracy, philosophy, and science. But is it true? How much of that view is colored by racist attitudes of 19th century classical scholars? Today, a controversial new theory that the roots of Greek civilization lie in ancient Egypt has archaeologists in an uproar.
What forces converged in prehistory to inspire the genius of the ancient Greeks? Who forged the destiny of Western civilization? In his book Black Athena, Martin Bernal of Cornell University contends that the seeds were sown in Africa and the Near East long before the arrival of the Greeks. His search for proof begins in Egypt, at the famed Step Pyramid at Saqqara, the first ever built. Surrounding the pyramid is a complex of buildings and courtyards believed to be a replica of the palace of King Zoser at nearby Memphis, then the capital of ancient Egypt.
We're now at Saqqara, which is a place of firsts. It was the place where the first pyramid was built. It was also the place where the first fluted columns were erected, and the place in general where stone architecture was used. So here we have the beginning not only of Egyptian civilization, but Western civilization as a whole. That from Egypt and from these beginnings in Egypt, we can see the development of Greece and Rome and modern European civilization as a whole.
17 centuries before the birth of Christ, Egypt ruled an empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates. Beyond, in the Aegean, was the island of Crete. Here, the empire of the legendary King Minos was reaching its zenith, while at Mycenae, the earliest roots of Greek civilization were taking hold. Connected by a vast network of trade routes, ships plied the seas laden with the treasures of the ancient world. Bernal believes that during this time, the Egyptians and the Phoenicians attacked the palaces of Crete and colonized the Aegean. Bernal's colleague at Cornell, John Coleman, is currently excavating the ancient city of Halif. An expert on the prehistory of Greece, he has found little to support the theory of an Egyptian invasion.
Personally, I don't believe that Greece ever was invaded by Egypt. There are very few documented instances of invasions of Greece, and we have no real evidence that in the form of, say, Egyptian language or Egyptian script, hieroglyphic, for instance, to suggest that, in fact, the Egyptians ever did come to Greece in any numbers.
Despite his critics, Bernal is intrigued by evidence that the Egyptians did control the Aegean. On the west bank of the Nile at Luxor, in the shadow of the Valley of the Kings, are the tombs of the nobles. Buried here are the most powerful men in Egypt next to the pharaoh.
We're now in the tomb of Rechmireh, who was a high official of the great pharaoh Thutmosis III. And this tomb has the usual accompaniment of the affairs of everyday life, but it also has a great deal about Rechmireh's duties as this high official, collecting taxes, administering within Egypt, but also supervising the foreign tribute that was given to the pharaoh. And you have a number of ranks. You have the Africans and you have the Syrians all giving their precious objects, and there you have the Minoans or Cretans dressed in their kilts and bringing objects that we know archaeologically were of Cretan manufacture. So there's no doubt about who these people were.
Professor Bernal sometimes speaks as if they were bringing tribute, as if Egypt somehow had control of the Aegean area. But in fact, recent studies have shown that they're gift bearers rather than indicating that they were in any way under the control of Egypt.
Now, whether the Greeks considered they were giving tribute or not is another question, but this is the way Rechmireh and his pharaoh, Thutmosis III, interpreted it.
While Bernal clings to the notion of invasion and domination, he insists it is not critical to his theory.
My historical scheme doesn't rely on the idea of Egyptian or Phoenician invasions or settlements of Greece. What I argue is that Greece is permeated with Egyptian and Phoenician influence because of contact over a period of more than 2,000 years. Contact of all sorts, because the two countries are not, the two regions are not that far apart. To take an analogy, Greece is about as far from Egypt as Japan is from China, and we would be very surprised indeed if we found that Japan had no Chinese influence, but in fact it is full of Chinese influence. That's not to say that Japan is a mere reflection of China, but that you cannot hope to understand Japan unless you realize its Chinese roots in that way. Similarly, I think we should not do as the classicists have done and try to view Greece in isolation without seeing its outside roots.
The Greeks were undoubtedly influenced by the Egyptians in the case of architecture and also in sculpture. One obvious example is the large Ionic style buildings that are found in eastern Greece and the eastern Aegean, such as the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus with its forest of columns, which resembles the Hippo style halls of Egypt. But as for all other things, the Greeks tended to transform the ideas that they gained.
The question of influence of Egypt on Greece in the ancient world is one that really can't be denied. There were certain aspects of the Egyptian cultural record which served as catalysts that enabled the Greeks to borrow, transform, and move on. So I would not, no one is really denying that the two nations were in contact, that the two cultures did talk to one another. But there are major, major differences in the way the Greeks adapted the Egyptian legacy. So to think, as some people have said, that Greece is really an offshoot or the child of Egypt is absolutely missing the point. The Greeks borrowed from Egypt, as they did from other civilizations, not only Egypt, turned it into something completely their own and went off in a direction. So, for example, if you look
Robert Bianchi, an Egyptologist with the Metropolitan Museum of New York, has joined a growing list of scholars who disagree with Bernal. He sees striking differences between the two cultures.
Something that the Egyptians never dreamed of doing, never wanted to do. So yeah, we have columns and architraves in both cultures, but the Greeks one have optical refinements that conform to their world outlook, and these do not appear in the Egyptian record.
The Great Pyramids of Giza are the most durable relics of the ancient world. The final resting place of the pharaohs, they testify to a fundamental tenet of the Egyptian faith: belief in the afterlife. To ensure the survival of the Ka, or spirit, the body first had to be preserved or mummified. Then, provisioned with food and surrounded by cherished possessions, the soul could depart for eternity.
The Greek mythology of life after death was remarkably similar to that of Egypt. The key shift is crossing a river by a ferry, which is a very Egyptian image for the way in which the dead travel. There was also the field of reeds, where the upper-class Egyptians lived in blissful happiness after their death, and this is very similar to Elysian, or the Champs-Élysées you have in France, these happy fields where you live. Then you have the word for the occupants of this territory, which is the same in Egyptian and Greek, Makarios in Greek, Macharu in Egyptian. So you have a number of striking similarities.
We have to understand that the Greeks, because they were using letters and words, were able to evolve an atomic theory. They were able to deal with invisibility. They were able to deal with how the universe was composed, what matter was all about. And that's a major, major difference. The Egyptians never speculated in that kind of rarefied way. This also holds true in areas of religion. Whereas, for example, the Egyptians believed that the body had to be intact in order to be reborn, the Greeks, on the other hand, would allow the bodies to be cremated. This is a heresy to the Egyptians because the body was now destroyed.
But it's interesting to note this may not reflect deep cultural differences, because in the United States today people use mummification, whereas in Western Europe they use cremation. You have this total difference in approach to the dead, which may reflect something about American society's materialism as opposed to Europe, but there's not much in it, and yet you have this fundamental difference in disposal of the dead.
The tombs of the pharaohs attest to their mortality, but to the ancients, they were gods. Absolute monarchs, they controlled the affairs of everyday life as well as the destiny of Egypt. In the conduct of politics, there was no room for the common man.
But imagine trying to maintain control in a land like Greece that's so broken up by mountains and sea. It's just simply not possible, and as a consequence, Greek civilization developed in a very different way, with local places gaining power on their own, and they never got together to create a federal state such as you find in Egypt, nor a great monarchy such as is found in Egypt or Persia or elsewhere in the ancient world.
And as a result, there was more individual freedom, more individual expression. The individual, as we know it today, as a concept, really is born in Greece, not in Egypt. someone, myself included, I guess, would be really out of place in Egypt in a nonconformist kind of way with the way one dresses or has clothes or a hairstyle. But this is something that would be perfectly adequate in Greece, where they stress the individual above a tyrant or a ruler in that sense.
Even in the Egyptian art, there was no freedom of expression. These paintings, breathtaking though they are, were not created. They were executed according to the dictates of the pharaohs. Artists painted what they were told, not what they saw. Highly stylized Egyptian figures appeared lifeless and two-dimensional, while the Greeks were beginning to explore the beauty of the human form.
The Greeks already begin to explore the body beautiful. The Greeks begin to be more naturalistic, more anatomically accurate, rather than stiff and rigid. And these two differences are also reflective of the differences in culture. Egypt was always a totalitarian regime ruled by a pharaoh. Greece was a democracy in which human beings and human thought counted. And when you look at an Egyptian statue and a Greek statue, you see that the rigidity of the Egyptian statue is the rigidity of a totalitarian regime. The naturalism of a Greek statue is a manifestation of the democratic principles that we know the Greeks formulated.
By 500 BC, the reign of the pharaohs had come to an end. Did the human spirit rise from the ashes of a dying civilization? Or did the Greeks invent themselves?
Greek is an Indo-European language, and therefore there must have been major influences from the north to make it one. On the other hand, there are an extraordinary number of elements of Greek language and other aspects of Greek civilization that are not Indo-European, and I believe these can be very plausibly explained as coming from Egyptian or Semitic.
The undeniable fact is, of course, that Egypt did play a role in the formative development of Iron Age Greece. That is to say that Egypt and its cultural traditions formed a catalyst whereby the Greek achievement was able maybe to get a spark and then develop. But what we have to understand is they are fundamentally different civilizations. Let me give you a case.
Backed by the archaeological record, most modern-day scholars agree with Robert Bianchi. Now it remains for Martin Bernal to prove his case.
My fundamental claim is not that Greece is a reflection of Egypt and the Levant. Clearly, it's a very different and independent culture. On the other hand, I believe it's impossible to understand Greece without seeing the depth of Egyptian and Semitic influences upon it. And this is what classicists have tried to avoid. They've tried to minimize something that I believe is absolutely central to the formation of Greek civilization.
Unfortunately, underlying the debate is the highly charged issue of race. Were the Egyptians black, as Bernal implies in Black Athena? Was Cleopatra black?
Was Cleopatra black? No, she was olive-skinned. She was a Greek. She was the Queen of Egypt, and her family had ruled Egypt for 300 years. But we know she was a Greek because the family was incestuous for 300 years. And so we're pretty sure about her bloodlines. Interestingly, the Romans tried to make her appear to be an Egyptian, but there's no question that she was in fact a Greek, and therefore the idea of her being black is not on.
The Egyptians regularly depict themselves in fairly light skin tones, and though it was surely a mixed population, as generally recognized, I doubt that the term black is appropriate.
The word black is now used in a very wide sense to cover a whole lot of people who are only of mixed African descent. And certainly the Egyptians, if they were to go to Mississippi or had been to Mississippi in the 1950s, if they had wanted a cup of coffee, they would certainly have been refused.
We are living in a world in which people are beginning to understand the value of non-European cultures, the contribution that women are making in the world. And if we're going to become picky and start to argue and nitpick about he's black, he's white, he's this and that, we are losing the entire focus of the humanities, and we will quibble today instead of being able to live in a more enlightened society that recognizes individual difference for what it is, but preserves and bequeaths to our children and our children's children those characteristics of civilization that we deem worthy of preserving.
The debate over what role Egypt played in the rise of Greece has raised an incendiary question. Was Egypt black? Does it matter? It matters deeply to many African Americans searching for role models in the ancient world. Scholars, however, insist that such a notion represents a serious misreading of the archaeological record. The evidence tells us that the Egyptians were a multicultural people. Indeed, it may have been the varied tapestry of their society that allowed them to achieve so much.